This video is part 1 of 3, where I had the opportunity to speak with Mark Ward about things related to the King James Version of the Bible, as well as King James Version Onlyism. So if you've got a couple minutes, tag along. I'm sure you'll find this a rather enlightening conversation. Hey YouTube, it's Dwayne here. So today I have a special guest here today. So we're going to talk with Mark Ward. And if you've been following my channel, you know we've been talking a little bit about the King James Bible lately. We've talked about some reasons why it's good to read it. And then we talked about some of the printer errors that have occurred in the past with some rather comical results. But now we're going to talk with who's probably much smarter than I am and knows a whole lot more about the King James. He wrote a book, okay? That's how smart he is. And he's going to tell us a little bit about himself, his channel, which is fantastic. Go there. I'll put a link below, and you can click on that, subscribe and like, and watch his stuff. He's got good stuff. He's here with us today to tell us a bit about his channel and to answer some questions we might have about the King James Bible. So Mark, why don't you take a second, tell us about who you are and what you hope to accomplish with your YouTube channel.
Great. Thanks for having me, Dwayne. I am the editor of Bible Study Magazine at Faithlife, makers of Logos Bible software. I am the author, as you said, of Authorized, the Use and Misuse of the King James Bible. I've written other books. I wrote some BJU Press textbooks. I was a Bible author there for 9 years. We used to be called Bible authors. It just sounded wrong because we didn't write the Bible, just Bible textbooks. I live in Washington State with my family. I just was ordained as an assistant pastor at Cornerstone Baptist Church, but I've been functioning in that role for about 5 years now. And then about my channel, think I saw that the message of this book needed to get to more people than were actually likely to bother to buy it and read it. And I wasn't in it for the money. I was in it to get the message out. So I thought the best platform would be YouTube, and I did a series of videos, one covering each chapter of the book, tried to make them entertaining and interesting, tried to fit the YouTube genre, and then I saw, I need to work more on these false friends that we may talk about, words in the King James that we don't know. So I did a series of 50 false friends in the King James, 30 videos through 50 false friends, and I'm still going. I just can't seem to stop YouTubing.
That's right. It's like you get one thing to YouTube and then it just explodes into, like, I think part of it is just it's fun to do them, right? So it makes it easier to get the message out when it's fun. You grew up in a Baptist background. I mean, you're part of the Baptist church today. And my experience was when I first became a Christian, I was part of the Baptist church. There was a very big emphasis on using the King James Bible specifically. So when I became a Christian, it was through some ministry that came to our school, actually, ironically. And I was given a New King James Bible, and so they kind of poked at me a little bit for having a New King James Bible. The Baptist church that I went to, like, their influence in my own life gave me an absolute, like, love for the Word of God. And amongst, like, the evangelical churches, I find that no church has a respect for the Word of God than the Baptist church. I mean, that's where I, solidified my belief in that. So, Mark, can you tell us about what it is about the King James Version specifically? Like, you seem to really love it. What is it? How did that love for the King James come around?
Well, why do I love breakfast cereal? I was given it, in my earliest memories. Why do I love Mom and apple pie? They are part of my culture. And those aren't super spiritual reasons. Reality is that whatever translation ended up being the monolith within English-speaking Christianity was going to collect around it a lot of associations. It was going to generate a lot of sayings in the language, and it was going to inspire a lot of love. So it wasn't necessarily because it was the King James Version, but it was because that was the Bible that I grew up with, and how could you not fall in love with it?
Yeah. And in speaking with, like, cultural stuff, right, the thing about Bible translations, especially like when they're sanctioned by higher authority, so to speak, is they do have a propensity to really standardize the way a language is used, right? So English is one of the cases where, the spelling of words and things of that nature had kind of been standardized along with the King James translation. And I think we see that in Luther's German translation as well. A lot of German was standardized because of the translation of the Bible in that language. So I guess all that to say that the King James has this absolutely huge impact on English culture, right?
David Crystal wrote a book about this. Begat, I think, was the title, and the idea is that the King James begat a number of phrases. I think he counted 200 something in English. I don't know how much, correlation doesn't equal causation. Mm-hmm. So obviously the King James and Pilgrim's Progress, were in the home of every English-speaking person practically, we're told, and how could they not have had a massive impact? But there were other forces, such as the spread of literacy and of printing that helped stabilize spelling, and the King James itself went through spelling changes and some minor revisions up through 1769. So the King James happened to hit at the right time, as did a number of other versions in European countries. And I don't necessarily want to credit it with all of the influence there, but it certainly had a lot of influence.
You were raised on the King James Version. So what made you come off of the King James Version into a different Bible translation? And what Bible translation are you currently using?
Well, most people who read the Bible have not been given by the Lord the opportunity to study Hebrew and Greek, right? Mm-hmm. And that means most people who read the Bible, and this would be in any language whatsoever, have to trust somebody to translate the Bible for them. And more than that, they have to trust somebody to recommend a translation or two or three or five to them.
Right.
And that was no different for me. I was in a King James only church in high school, and I went to their Christian school, and I had an excellent experience. They were loving people who taught me well. Mm-hmm. But when I went to college, I went to a Christian college that was very conservative, but was not King James only. And my professors there and my pastor there, who was also a Bible teacher at the school, although he preached from the King James Version, he actually was caught up in a controversy over it that he didn't want to be in when a rival Christian college made some attack videos attacking mine, saying that we were leavening the lump by allowing modern versions, even though we all use the King James in our churches and in all the classrooms and the chapel. But because of that controversy, my pastor worked through a long series, and as a teenager at the time, as a college student, I was probably, 18, I thought, why is he taking so long? Yeah. But then I realized over time he did it because he was a good shepherd and he knew to go slow. But through that influence and a couple other teachers at school who taught me about Bible translation, I realized I can't hold to this King James onlyism anymore. I still love my King James. And then I started to learn Greek, and then later in seminary, Hebrew. Any vestige of King James onlyism died away. Once you really understand what a translation is, and once you recognize that the Bible doesn't tell us that God's going to inspire translators, but instead they had choices to make, and they did the best they could, and they did an excellent job, but that doesn't mean it was perfect. I'm after what did God say. I'm not after having only one translation of what God said. And then last thing, you maybe can't see it on my shelf, I think it's on the other corner, but I had a parallel Bible that I bought for $50 from the bookstore across the street from my college when I was 18 years old, 1999. And it had the NIV, the King James, the Amplified Bible, and the New American Standard Bible. And I wore that thing out, and I took tons of notes in it. And by comparing translations over and over and over again, I was inoculated completely against any form of one Bible onlyism, including the kind that was in existence at that college where only formal Bible translations were good. But I began to see the NIV is helping me understand, and why should I complain about that? What's wrong exactly with that? I just want to understand what God said, and any tool that he gives me to do that, I'm all four. And that's how I
Yeah.
got out of King James Onlyism.
Nice. That's like what a number of people I've heard say, including yourself. I think you say it in your videos. Is what's the best Bible translation to use? Well, the one you're going to read. I mean, there's a few that you would avoid, but for the most part, I mean, if you pick an NIV off the shelf or you pick a New King James Version off the shelf or a CSB, it's not going to lead you astray, right? So. Yeah, that's fantastic. So now, in your book, Authorized, the Use and Misuse of the King James Version, there was a section in there that kind of spoke to me a little bit, partly because I'm a programmer by trade. So you talk a little bit about how the King James Version is determined to be really easy to read based on these algorithms that can, do some work with the language and then spit out a number and say, here's how easy it is to read. And so typically people who really love the King James Version will try to get others to read it by saying it's not difficult. And then they use the subjective number to somehow prove that it's not. Now, of course, just simply reading the text would refute that. But objectively, how do these algorithms work that determine that a specific reading of anything really is, grade 4 level or grade 8 level or...
Yeah, good question. Well, this is how they work right here. You can't really see it, but there's a little algorithm at the top. Now it's in focus. And it measures the number of total words, the number of total sentences, the number of total syllables, and then it does a little math, which isn't really all that complicated, which is based on the average length of English sentences, and it tries to come up with a number between 1 and 12. So you have, the grade system, first grade, second grade, all the way up to 12th grade. But you just have to ask these questions like, well, is it true that always longer sentences are more difficult? Maybe it's generally true, but not always. And is it really true that shorter words are always easier? So what I pointed out was that this Flesch Kincaid readability analysis tool doesn't have any idea what words it's looking at. You could replace every other English word in the King James with a Swedish word or a Khoisa word or a Russian word, or do every third word and make it Arabic, and it would have no idea. It's not reading, it's counting. So it doesn't know that we don't know the word call, C-A-U-L. To them, C-A-U-L, to Flesch Kincaid tool, it's just as easy as call, C-A-L-L. Right. And the computer doesn't know whether people are actually understanding this or not. It's a rough and ready tool that's useful when you don't have a chance to read a whole book. For children's librarians, you just can't possibly read all the children's books that are out there. It gives you, an average difficulty level. But on the King James, it is essentially worthless.
Yeah, well, it works based on comparison with other books that are in like language, right? And the difference with the King James Version being 400 years earlier, it's got nothing to compare it against. Unless you were to take like other literature from the time, like maybe Shakespeare and whatever, and run it and compare it with that, it might give you an indication of what its reading level is in regards to the literature of the time. But it's very hard, very impossible, I would say, to cross the gap of the language differences.
Yeah, I mean, even if you did compare it to other literature of the time, all you're finding out is which of these pieces of literature has shorter sentences and shorter words. Mm-hmm. That simply does not mean it's easier to understand. Yeah. Maybe it does. Sometimes it does. But you can't know that unless you set aside the computer and actually read the text for yourself. It's humans who determine the difficulty level of the readability of a given text.
And I mean, it doesn't do any analysis on grammar either. There's some pretty significant differences
in
grammar in King James. I want to say Elizabethan language. I know that's not Elizabethan; it's more Jacobean. But
people like to make that distinction, and I always feel like that's it's too fine a distinction. Yeah. These men started, a few years after Elizabeth died, and Elizabethan is the period So I'm happy to call it
Okay,
Elizabethan
good.
English.
So yeah, and this just comes down to the realization that, computers can't do everything.
They can't read.
I read an article once about the difficulty of artificial intelligence to determine what the antecedent is for a pronoun. So, yeah, we're still limited in our capacity to use computer technology to read stuff, plain and simple.
And let's point out that's something that a 2-year-old can do, but a computer can't do it.
That's right.
Computers are incredible, and I rely on them all day, every day. But there are some things that only humans will ever be able to do, and I'm convinced that understanding is one of those things. It is necessarily a human thing. It's for beings made in the image of God.